Welcome
to the Expert,
PK,
and Newbie Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Expert, PK and Newbie Podcast. It's very exciting. This is our very first episode that we're doing here today. I'm Josh, and I'll introduce our lovely host sitting beside us here in just a second. But I'm just going to explain what this podcast is about. We've all sort of in our lives tried to read the Bible from start to finish, and it's a very daunting task to try and do. 66 books. We get through it and then we sort of just fall off. So this podcast here is an aim to help us go through it. So each week we will be going through different passages of the Bible and helping you, the listener, at home to be able to read it with us, whilst the three of us in our different capacities are able to give different perspectives. And so the title of the show, The Expert, PK and Newbie, is sort of designed to be able to give the three different perspectives of three different people from three different walks of life. So we have the expert who's done sort of more formal study, formal theology, has gone to uni and is able to bring that insight from there. PK, who is myself, which stands for pastor's kid, sort of brings that, being brought up with the church from birth, as my father is a pastor, is able to bring that insight through the background of being the behind the scenes of the church and seeing the sort of the inner workings, both good and bad. And I like to think I know a lot, but really I don't. I'm just sort of scratching the surface, really. But I have the title of the PK, so the stereotype is I should know everything, right? And so we have the newbie. The newbie is someone who is relatively new to the faith. It's not like, bam, yesterday there was a conversion or something, but relatively new to the faith and is hungry to learn and is hungry to consume. And it is, and they have their very valuable insight. And so hopefully we're able to come together and bring our three different perspectives. Well, let's introduce everyone here. So like I said before, I'm Josh. By trade, I'm a filmmaker. I'm working the TV and movie industry, working on various different projects. I also help out in the church as PK. I'm doing a lot of the behind the scenes stuff, which is also why I like to do the film and TV route. Let me introduce the expert. So we have our expert, Lachlan.
Hello. I want to just point out that when we use the word expert, we're using it very liberally. I wouldn't say I'm someone with a crazy encyclopedic knowledge of the Bible, but I am someone who's probably spent longer looking at it and studying it than your average churchgoer. So I just want to clear that up at the beginning. If I happen to get things wrong, which I won't, it's okay. But if I happen to get things wrong, then there's a grace that's allowed here, hopefully. Anyway, hello, I am Lachlan. Let's start off with the reason I've been chosen as the expert, which is a very fun title because, again, I don't know if it's totally accurate. But I studied at Sydney Missionary and Bible College, where I got a Masters of Divinity. Incredibly pretentious sounding degree, but very fun to drop in conversations. So I studied my master's there. I currently work for a church. I look after all things youth ministry related, which is really fun. So I get to engage a lot with young people, both youth and young adults who help serve and help me run this ministry, which is fantastic. Then I also do a bit of marking, like Bible College marking for the Australian College of Ministries, which is a nice little side hustle. Keeps me in an academic mindset as I get to read people's essays on the Bible and God's Word, and keeps me thinking about it, which I found really helpful over the past year or so. In terms of what I do normally, well, when you work for a church, it sort of consumes your life a little bit. I'm not saying whether that is healthy or not, but I definitely spent a lot of time at church. I'm engaged and getting married in a month. Depending on when this drops, I'll probably be married, to be honest. But that is also currently consuming a lot of time, like really joyous time, but still getting ready for a wedding, or more importantly, marriage after that takes up a lot of time. And then I try and fit all my friends and family into whatever spare time I have. So any other hobbies sort of go out the window, and I end up drinking way too much coffee, just trying to catch up with the people that I love in my life. There's a tiny little insight about me.
A little snippet into Lachlan's life.
I reckon.
Excellent. So Morgan, hi.
Hello.
Can you introduce yourself?
I'm Morgan. I am a healthcare worker in Victoria.
Victoria.
I'm relatively new to faith, so about 2 years going on being baptised. Came into faith after a big struggle in my own life. And I had a lot of questions at the start that I thought were dumb questions. But now having a lot of friends come to faith, they're having the same questions. So I came into this podcast hoping to be that bridging that gap between new Christians and wanting to know more. I'm currently studying youth work, finishing my degree, and hoping to do some kind of ministry study down the track. I'm not sure what yet.
Nice, excellent. And just to sort of reiterate, like what you said about the titles, is yes, there are titles, but that doesn't mean that is the be or end all. And also what we sort of discuss and say here isn't necessarily the be or end all. We encourage everyone to explore for their own and going into it on their own and going through it. We're just here to hopefully guide you through that path as we go through. Excellent. Wow, this is very exciting, is it? So we should jump right in. So what passage are we doing today, Mr. Lachlan?
We are looking at Matthew chapters 1 and 2.
Perfect.
Today's passage comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapters 1 and 2. If you haven't already, please pause now and read those chapters. In these chapters, we find the genealogy of Jesus followed by his birth and childhood travels from Bethlehem to Egypt, before finally settling in Nazareth. All right, let's get back to the podcast.
I thought I would jump in right at the beginning because we've just read 2 chapters from the beginning of a book of the Bible. And I think one of the most important things when it comes to understanding the Bible at all is understanding the context of whatever you're reading. And given that this is the first episode on the Gospel of Matthew, I like to always ask 4 questions about any book of the Bible that I'm reading, because I think context is just like the most important thing when it comes to understanding. So if it's all right with you two, I'm just going to ask the 4 questions.
Of course.
Get your thoughts on them.
Yep.
And we'll go from there. And then we'll dig into the details of the passage. But I just think as a starting point, it's helpful. So I always think the good starting place for question 1 is authorship. So who wrote this? Any thoughts?
Oh, who wrote this?
I have absolutely no idea.
I'm trying to rack my brain.
I can't tell if we're being serious or not.
No, as in like it's because it's Matthew, right? But I don't know if it was a trick question of like it was someone else who wrote it and just Matthew's name on it.
It doesn't have to be a trick question. Like,
yeah, I don't know.
It's allowed to just be Matthew.
Yeah, just Matthew. All right, well there you go, Matthew. For some reason we're like, oh wow, he's stumped us.
Question 1, we're already confused.
And then I look down, I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. It's just Matthew, isn't it?
Do we know anything about Matthew? You don't have to know anything about Matthew. Just figured I'd ask.
Tax collector?
Oh yeah, nice.
Don't know why I know that information.
No, that's helpful to know. Fun fact, this gospel has like 3 or 4 different words for coins in it, where every other gospel just uses like the one word for coin, whereas whoever wrote this gospel clearly liked to differentiate between different types of coins, which feels like a random thing to include in your gospel.
Do we know why that's the case?
I'm assuming because Matthew was a tax collector.
Yeah, so he just knew about coins and so wanted
just included it.
to include it. Oh, there you go.
Now, I should point out that most scholars, not that many people necessarily agree that Matthew wrote this, but the early church, so we're talking about people who, like, only a few decades on from the writing of this book, like, unanimously agreed that Matthew, the disciple of Jesus, who was once a tax collector before he became a disciple, wrote this book. And so, yes, modern scholars will argue about how it may not be Matthew, but I think the early church is a really good witness. Like if you were going to make up who wrote this gospel, you would choose Peter or John or Paul. Like you choose someone really famous in the early church. Matthew was just kind of one of the 12 disciples, but not a well-known one. Like it's not the one I would choose if I was going to make up a gospel. So the fact that his name got associated with this gospel from like the very beginning, there's literally never been any other suggestion of anyone else it could have been. I think it's fairly safe to say, no, it was Matthew who wrote this gospel.
Oh, that's interesting.
So that's the first question. I always think authorship of a biblical text is important to figure out. The next question I like to ask is, what genre are we reading? Because I think genre can determine a lot. Once again, this is not actually a trick question, just something I think we should bring up when we look at any book of the Bible.
It's the recounting. Well, is it the recounting genre?
Yeah, some type of historical narrative, biographical maybe.
Rather than more like the poetic writings or things like songs or poems or things.
Yeah, because the Bible has so many genres in it. Like it's got elements of mythology in there, or grand apocalyptic visions, or poetry, or parables. But this just seems to be straight up biography. Like just read it as something that is happening.
And that's a lot of the New Testament, right? That's pretty much.
Yeah.
This is just the recounts.
The good first half of the New Testament before we start getting to just a whole bunch of letters, which is like, here's some theology written in a letter. Please take it. And
that's a whole nother discussion to get into the letters.
Yeah, we will get there later, hopefully. The next question I always ask is, what is the historical background of the book? Like, where and when are the events of the book set?
Bethlehem.
Yeah.
Because it's the birth of Jesus. And then there's the escape to Egypt. And then Nazareth.
Ends up there, yeah.
Yeah.
By the end of our passage. Yeah, it's set in ancient Israel in the 1st century. Like that's just important to keep in mind. Because while the whole New Testament is basically set in Israel in the 1st century, when you take the Bible as a whole, there's lots of different places it could be set and time periods it could be set. And the final one, I may just go on to answer because it involves having read the entire book. But like, what is the purpose? Like you want to know why a book was written before you dive into actually understanding it well. And as I read through the Gospel of Matthew in preparation for this, I kind of sensed two different purposes behind the author. And the first purpose seems to be he wanted to show unbelieving Jews that Jesus is the Messiah. Now, Matthew, who wrote this, is a Jew. Jesus is a Jew. He clearly wanted the salvation of the Jews. And that is why, like, there is, even in these first 2 chapters, he references the Old Testament, so like the Jewish Holy Scriptures, so many times in just 2 chapters, which I think shows where he's coming from as an author. The second thing I think Matthew is doing is that he wants to convey the teachings of Jesus. And so this gospel, more than any other gospel, was used in the early church because it has so much of the teaching of Jesus within it. It's not just a story of what he did. There's like huge chunks of Jesus' teaching and preaching. And so Matthew includes all of that, which I think is really helpful. Was really helpful for the early church. That's why they used it so much. But is also really helpful for us to just literally read what Jesus was trying to convey. And so I just think as we started off, those 4 questions of authorship, genre, historical background, and purpose are just nice to keep in our minds as we now dive into, ideally, the details of the text.
Yes, I think for me, the first thing that stands out is the genealogy of Jesus. So for me, what is genealogy?
It's sort of just like a list of ancestors. It's like your family line tracing you way back into history.
Because there was just so many names and so detailed. For me, I was like overwhelmed with the amount of people.
Yeah, fair enough.
In that first part.
Were there any names that you recognised on that list, Morgan, from your time having read the Bible?
Yeah, like Abraham and Isaac, Judah. But then there were some that I can't even say. So...
That's always like whenever you have to read the Bible in front of anyone and it's a name heavy passage, it's always
the worst.
It is. You just, am I saying that correctly?
Or a location heavy passage.
For me, yeah, it was those names. There was just so many names. When you stop to think about it, like the initial thought is, I feel like, all right, these are all the names. Okay, all right, well, we just have to get through these names and then we'll get to the real stuff. We'll get to the real stuff. But then if you stop and actually think about it, it's like, well, actually, no. If you put it into your own context, you would want the importance of your own lineage and who your descendants and everyone behind you, and you wouldn't want that dismissed.
Yeah, let's get to Jesus' dad. And
and they went, cool, excellent.
Because as I went through it, I tried to highlight the names I actually knew, and like beginning of the list, I was on fire because like here's all the famous Old Testament stories, and then you kind of get from where it mentions Babylon and they return from Babylon. The rest of those names are totally unknown to me. I was like, who are these people? That has no significance. From even like a biblical point of view, you're like, I don't know who these people are. But I think they're important because they do link Jesus ultimately to David and Abraham, which is just important because like when it comes to biblical history, you got Abraham and David as like your big heavyweights of the Old Testament. And all the promises of God come through their lines. Like God makes promises to Abraham about what his family and descendants will do. And then God makes similar promises to David about what his descendants will do. So when Matthew starts off his gospel about how this is Jesus Christ, this is going to be the Messiah, the fulfillment of God's promises, any Jewish person is going to be like, but is he in the right line? Like if he's not actually directly related to both Abraham and David, then all of his claims are sort of for naught. Like they're nothing. So you just sort of have to start here for a Jewish reader. Otherwise, they can ignore the rest.
I think that can sometimes get lost on us. We're sort of privileged to have the knowledge of before, after, and have the sort of the entire book at our fingertips. And so we can easily flick through to the New Testament, Old Testament, and we can grab all this information. But like what you're saying, those people would have needed the lineage to confirm the importance of this, or just to confirm that we are talking about the right person here. For us, we're like, yep, no, no, that's all good. I don't need to know who he's from because it's him. But it's so in that context, yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think the detail it's gone into and listing it like that just highlights the importance of it was an important event and line of people to recognise. Going off that too, something that stood out to me is the number 14, mentioning 14 generations 3 times. Is there a reason?
Can you think of a reason?
No, I don't know if it's just to highlight 14 generations, like it's quite a big number. It's not like just 3 generations or 4, but I'm not sure why 14. Is there significance?
Well, I want to start off by saying that I think what Matthew has done is selectively choose people for this list. I don't think it's actually exactly 14 generations between each of these things. There's lots of genealogies in the Old Testament, and I think you'll find a few people that were omitted from this list. So Matthew has very intentionally crafted it so that it's 3 sets of 14. And so we really have to, we're meant to recognize that. We're meant to see that as significant and important. I did a bit of research about this before coming because that also stood out to me when I first read it. And there's no guarantee answer. Some people think it's just Matthew highlighting the fact that there's 3 distinct stages of Israel's history. There's the Abrahamic bit, there's the Davidic kingship, and then there's the post-exile bit. And so we just really want to highlight 3 different sections. Another idea that people suggest is that David's name, so the way Hebrew works as a language is they don't have they don't have numbers. And so they will use a Hebrew letter in place of a number, and you're just meant to tell from context that it's a number. If you look at the Hebrew letters that make up the word David, it actually accounts for 14. And so some people think that Matthew is intentionally grabbing onto this theme of 14, which is sort of the number of David, and just directing our attention so that everything about this list just screams son of David at us. So we go from Abraham to David, 14 generations, just like the number of David. And then we go from David to the Babylonian exile, the number of David. I think he's just really in our face about David is important. Everything about Jesus's background and history and ancestry links to David being important.
So it's sort of, again, that context gets lost on us because we're not reading it in its original text, in its original translation of Hebrew.
This gospel was originally written in Greek, not Hebrew. So this would have just been assumed background knowledge for the Jewish readers.
Yep.
But there's also a bit of debate and discussion about the language of this gospel, because certain early church members spoke about how Matthew wrote a gospel in Hebrew, and the only gospel of Matthew we have is clearly written in Greek. So that's a fun discussion maybe for another time. Bring it back up later if we have time.
Well, going into the sort of the further on from just the lineage, we've got Joseph actually accepting his son, but also accepting his future or wife. At that point, he had pledged to marry her. Immediately, his brain's going to, she's cheated on me, to then turning around and hearing from an angel. For me, which is very sort of ingrained into sort of my knowledge of Jesus and sort of the Christmas story of everything. Especially as I get older, I go back to being what would have Joseph felt like during the time. Because a lot of the time we talk about Mary and her experiences and everything. I always think well, Joseph also had a hard time trying to deal with all that. Not to mention the unknown of all of a sudden this has happened to my future wife, and not really knowing what to do or how to handle that situation. then an angel comes and sort of clears it up. But still, there's the trust that you're having to follow that through. And then what other people would have thought around, because there would have been a big social element to this all of them, especially because there's emphasis on he wanted to do this quietly. He wanted to divorce her quietly. So there would have been a big social. There would have been a lot of, I imagine, lots of sort of whispering and gossip that was happening around town. Also, not to mention the fact that you're being told that your son is the son of God.
Yes.
You know, it's like, well, how do you grapple with the fact that your own son is like kind of not your own son, but isn't, like, I can't comprehend that. I don't have kids, but I'm just like to be told that your own son is not really yours, is God. It's God's son. Yeah. I'm just like,
I've never really thought about it like that.
Yeah, I'm just having
I'm
just having this existential crisis at the moment of like what if I was a father, what would I be thinking in this moment? Like,
yeah, and that's a lot for him to take on, like being told what to do. It's kind of demands, and then also, did my wife cheat on me? Like, this is all happening, and also the idea he might have had for his future is now not that. He has been given his future.
Yeah, the stigma that they all would have lived with for the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
Like, their culture was very private about sex. Like, that was something that you only did in marriage as a Jewish person.
Yeah.
And so people would have assumed that Mary was either unfaithful and Joseph was being the bigger man and just accepting it, or they would have been like, they just couldn't wait. And how unacceptable and shameful is that?
It's a lot.
Yeah, a lot of pressure to live with for the rest of your life.
And it's that, like, I think, like, Morgan, what you said, it's that uprooting of your own life, especially because we try to plan what our life might look like, but this is just throwing it for a curveball. This is just throwing everything, like, you know, it's like, no, all right, we're doing this now. Great, cool.
Yeah. When I was reading this and I looked a bit into it, the angel was Gabriel. Is that a significant why it's Gabriel? Because I know Gabriel's in the Bible in other parts. Like, why that angel, or just
we basically only get 2 angels ever named in the Bible.
Yeah, okay.
Gabriel and Michael. Like, they're just God's servants, and they rock up and they say things
and then leave.
Yeah, basically.
Yep.
I'm sure there's a whole theology of different angels and what they do, but I don't know if it's ultra important for it to be specifically Gabriel who rocks up here.
Yeah, okay.
So there's a question here, which is, virgin will conceive and give birth to a son. They will call him Emmanuel, but then we call him Jesus.
What happened?
Yeah, did they just miss the memo and give him the wrong name?
The wrong name, the wrong birth certificate.
I think we're meant to understand, because Matthew doesn't see any conflict there. Like, he happily writes, here's the prophecy, he shall be called Emmanuel, and then they named him Jesus. Like, he happily writes that and sees no conflict. And so I think the reason he sees no conflict is, while Jesus' name would be Jesus, he would be Emmanuel, which means God with us. Like, he literally embodies the concept of Emmanuel, which is God physically with his people, even though he's going to be named Jesus, which is fun because when we get to the other end of the gospel in chapter 28 at the very, very end, Jesus' like final words to his disciples is, I am with you always. And so we start off the gospel with this coming Messiah is Emmanuel, God with you, and it ends with Jesus promising that very thing to his disciples.
That's cool.
Want to return to the genealogy.
Yes.
But I find it really, really interesting that Matthew includes 4 women in this list. And like, that's not something you would normally include in a genealogy. But all 4 of these women are like significant in the biblical story, but also significant for how in most family histories they would be the person you'd want to sweep under the rug. Like, they'd be the person you like, don't talk about crazy Uncle Shane. Like, those are these sort of women that are listed like pridefully in place of these are important members of Jesus' lineage. Because you've got Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. And so you've got Tamar and Rahab, who were both prostitutes. You've got Ruth, who was a foreigner, and you got Bathsheba, who committed adultery. And so like, all a bit questionable. Not that the men in this line weren't. Like, very, very questionable things went on with the men in this line too. But I just found it really interesting that Matthew decided to, in God's inspired word, to include these women. And I'm seeing that as a moment of grace. I'd be curious as to why you think, but I'm seeing it as God being very clearly of, I've chosen and redeemed these people and this lineage, and whatever the sins of the people in this line, it's leading up to Jesus, and that is a good thing. Here's a moment of grace shining through in the very early chapters of Matthew.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. Because later on it says he will save his people from their sins. It's kind of like an example of, I've done this, so it's going to work. Like it's, yeah. I don't know. I think grace as well, a bit of mercy.
Jesus is not coming from like a noble line of quote unquote royalty, good people. It's like, no, these can be your everyday people or your everyday
everyday dodgy, sinful people.
Yeah. And that no matter sort of where he's come from, it's still significant. And it's not lost or doesn't make it less.
That's a cool perspective. I like that.
Love it.
So there's multiple gospels, and they're all sort of recounting sort of the same thing. So is all the genealogies the same, or are they different?
I mean, you would hope they would be all the same. Unfortunately, that's not exactly the case. That we only have 2 genealogies of Jesus. At the very beginning of Matthew, and then in like the 2nd chapter of Luke, and they are actually different, which I don't know about you guys, but that feels concerning to me.
Do we know why they're different?
We don't know exactly why, but we have thoughts and solutions to what would otherwise be a pretty awful issue to have with our gospel accounts. I don't know whether I just answer or whether you guys want to take potshot guesses or thoughts.
I mean, I to try and answer it, I would be like, well, a lot of this is recounting, right? And so it's being information that's being passed on from people to people, and either through text or via word of mouth. So you're always going to have differing sort of stuff that gets lost in translation, or I would just imagine over time, from a lot of when these recounts were written, that it would be that you would have some differences in it. But if the majority of it stayed the same, then I would think that that sort of gives you a clear understanding that that is the moment that happened. And if someone, let's say one of the writers rocked up late to something and they got something they wrote it ever so slightly different because they were late to whatever this thing was, or whoever the account that they were hearing this from. But if the majority of it was correct, I don't know. I feel like I'm rambling.
It's all right. You're allowed to ramble.
Yeah, that would be my thought process on why it would be slightly different. Like I would imagine that if you saw David in there and then it went down to Joseph, great. Well, for me at the least, if the top and the tail were the same, and then everyone in between, because especially if you look at your own family trees, they can be quite different, or it's very hard to sort of try and look back at things. So I don't know, for me, if the top and the tail were the same, then I'd be like, great, cool.
Would it concern you if the grandfathers were different? So they both list a different father for Joseph?
Maybe, because Joseph is probably an easier one to look at who was his grandfather. So is it different?
Yeah.
Oh, there you
go. The one we just read in Matthew has Jacob as Joseph's father, and I believe Luke has Eli. It's Luke 3, by the way. I said Luke 2 before, and that was incorrect. Now, something that's often offered as the solution here is Jesus has 2 parents. He's got Joseph, he's got Mary. It could be a lineage of each. I mean, that's a potential solution. I don't know if it's necessarily the right one, but it's like an easy potential. Like you could appeal to that straight away and be like, we don't have to worry about this anymore because there is at least a possible answer. An answer that I feel slightly more persuaded by is that Luke gives us like a physical family tree, whereas Matthew here gives us more like the line of succession. So we know that when it comes to kings and kingdoms and succeeding, it's not always necessarily the firstborn son who succeeds. It is like the kingship stays in the family. Like all it takes is for a king to not have a son and suddenly it will jump over to like an uncle somewhere. Like a lot of people think that this is the line of succession, One of the reasons we think Matthew may be the line of succession is that there's a king listed in Jesus' genealogy here by the name of Jeconiah, which is in verse 11. Now, in the Old Testament, one of the prophets actually curses him and says, none of your descendants will ever inherit the throne. So the fact that he's listed in Jesus' genealogy could be concerning if we're to take that prophecy really, really seriously of none of your descendants will inherit the throne. But if we look at it as the line of succession, we can say that Jesus is related to David, like genetically via a different route, but the line of succession still passes through this king who we're told his physical descendants would not inherit the throne. And so part of the thought process would be that while Eli and Luke was Joseph's biological father, Jacob was potentially the next in line for the throne and then maybe had no kids, and so it passed over to Joseph. And so the lines converge at important points. They both link up at David, they both link up at Joseph, but they're different because one traces physicality and one traces, hey, who actually has the right to rule? Who is the heir? And I think that is probably the most persuasive I've heard about why they're different.
Oh, that makes sense. I think that makes sense, especially because I wouldn't have thought of it in terms of succession. I would have always thought of it by blood, like immediately one from the next, rather than, it probably then swapped over to the uncle. No, that makes sense to me. I can get behind that.
Get behind the explanation?
Yeah,
that's what I like to hear.
I like that one.
So something else I was thinking about while reading through that was verse 25. So why Joseph waited till after Jesus was born to have sex with Mary.
Thoughts, Josh?
Well, okay, so this would be a very personal answer, which I'm happy to sort of say. I don't know, the thought of having sex while your wife is pregnant weirds me out a little. So I don't know if it is just that like surface level of that. So to me, I'm like, yeah, sure, I would too.
Your poor future wife. Sorry, she's sitting in the room, so I feel like I can say that.
She is.
I don't know if we need to cut this or not, but
Yeah,
hey, it's there now.
But that would be like, thinking about it, that is the very first thought that pops into my head is, well, and then also the funny thought that pops into my head of like, well, if you've been told this is the Son of God, do you really want to go down that rabbit hole of?
Yeah, kind of off that, it's like, is it a bit of a fear thing? Like, this has all happened so quick. I've not got control over this situation. Like, what could happen? Like, is this just a bit of a fear? Like, it's kind of a supernatural phenomenon kind of situation. Like, yeah, is it what's going to happen if I do that?
Yeah. Or even just out of respect, like just waiting. It's either for Mary or even for, for God, or just even for the people, like what it would look like for the people around. Even though it's a very private thing, there's already rumors and everything would have been spreading. So let's not add fuel to the fire.
Yeah, and it could be a bit of proof, like if Joseph was doubting, did Mary cheat on me? Is this real? Like when it actually happens and he's like, oh, no, it's fine. Like this is actually that happening.
I think this is the Bible's way of reinforcing that Jesus was not the son of Joseph. Like you could have a situation where Mary's like, I'm pregnant, which is not really. And Joseph is like, oh, yeah, well, we'll just get together now. And then Jesus is born a little bit early and it's like, could totally be Joseph's son. But like even the genealogy ends in such a way that it was, let me read it for us. And Jacob, the father of Joseph, who's the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born. Like it's very clear, even in that verse, that Jesus is not Joseph's son. And so I think to whatever reason Joseph had, God and the biblical authors used that to really hammer home that Jesus was not born from Joseph. Like he had nothing to do with it.
Which is amazing because my brain immediately goes to the identity crisis Joseph would have had with his own son, and how hard that would have been. Because even in this, like if Joseph was to read this back, it's clearly stating it's not Joseph's son. Like and then to hear that would have been like just like whoa.
Yeah, it's a bit disheartening, isn't it? Like sons are like, fathers take such pride in having a son and a boy, and it's just like, yeah, it's a bit disheartening for him probably.
But in the same time, you've got to grapple this fact of, well, no, this is bigger than just me.
Yeah.
And this is for the greater, there's a greater purpose here. And I know I would flip flop between the two. It's like, oh no, it's for this, but still in the same breath, like you're going, you would have really had to wrestle with this.
I also think it's important here to point out that Joseph and Mary then did have a normal married relationship post Jesus being born. Now, we're all Protestants here. Our Catholic brothers and sisters believe in a doctrine called the perpetual virginity of Mary, which is that she stayed a virgin for the rest of her life. But I just don't think you could defend that biblically. Like, this makes it pretty clear that until she had given birth, they didn't.
Yeah.
And then we've got brothers and sisters of Jesus popping up in the next few chapters. So I think it's just very clear that once Mary gave birth to Jesus, this momentous event, this momentous person, then her and Joseph had the model marriage from there. Like, there wasn't anything extra placed upon him as a husband. Like, they consummated the marriage. They had more kids. So, sorry, Catholic brothers and sisters, if you're listening to this, but I don't think that is a correct doctrine to hold.
No, or even just think of it biologically.
Yeah.
So chapter 2, guys. We diving into chapter 2?
Yes. What are your thoughts, Morgan, on chapter 2?
Yeah, so straight up when I was reading chapter 2, Herod just stood out to me the whole way through. But in the start, I just got vibes that he was threatened.
Insecure.
Extremely threatened.
So insecure.
And yeah, he was really questioning what happened and he wanted that proof. And he was getting people together and like the journey that they were going to take. It's just such a big, significant journey. Like, he was taking servants and scribes and all these people, and that journey would have taken geographically a few weeks. So it was a big journey to make to see the proof of the star that they all saw.
And the proof he wanted the proof, but what was his actual goal in that? Because if he was really threatened by it, he was there to kill him off, right?
Yep.
Yeah, I think he wanted to prove them wrong and see that it wasn't actually there, even though he knew it probably was. He wanted to not see it.
You got to remember that Herod was a Roman appointed king of Israel. So he wasn't descended from David. He wasn't even an Israelite.
Yeah.
Like, the people hated him. And the Jews are well known for their uprisings and their rebellions. And so, as the Roman appointed ruler of this area, you had to be a bit careful to keep a good hold of everything. So like, even the hint of a Jewish king being born is enough for someone as power hungry and insecure as Herod to take some pretty drastic actions.
Well, it's something I didn't realize until it's sort of deep into it, like, and we'll probably get into this later, so we won't touch on it too much, but there were lots of sort of Jewish rebel groups in the areas, and especially later, like radical Jewish people. So there would have been lots of threats around.
I also think in the beginning of that, the imagery of the star, that would have been crazy to see. Like I said before, like supernatural phenomenon kind of stuff. Like, that would have been so crazy to see. And you'd want to go and see it and you'd want to find it, see what everyone's talking about. And I think it's quite significant.
Well, I mean, that leads to the question of what was the star. So you've just assumed it was a crazy supernatural phenomenon, which, to be honest, I think that's where I eventually land of, we don't need to explain every miracle in the Bible by some sort of naturalistic explanation.
Yeah.
Like, it can just be God doing his work, showing a certain star to lots of people. But there's lots of discussion about what that star could be. I recently listened to another podcast. I don't know if I'm allowed to spruik other podcasts on this, but
I think it's
John Dixon's podcast, Undeceptions, I find a really helpful Christian resource as well. And he did a whole episode on what is the star. And there's been a bunch of ideas from comets to supernovas. But one idea that he presented, well, he got an expert in to present on, was the idea that it could have been an astrological sign. So we sort of sit here in the 21st century and laugh at astrology as a belief system. But all it would have taken is for a certain like planet to be in a certain quadrant of the sky. And if you were a wise astrologer from Parthia, then you would look at that and go, I use my certain skill set to understand what this means. And so, for instance, in 7 BC, both Saturn and Jupiter would have risen in a section of the sky that the Babylonians called the Westland or Palestine. And so Jupiter's like the king of the planets type idea. And so simply the idea of Jupiter being in a certain segment of the sky could have been enough for the local astrologers to go, there's a new king of Palestine arising, and then go on a journey to find him. So like that's a potential answer to what the star itself was. It wasn't necessarily supernatural. It was just, if you're an astrologer, you would have noticed the signs.
Yeah.
Now, the reason I don't land there eventually is we see in chapter 2 that they follow the star directly to Bethlehem. That, that could just be that the star sign they saw led them to Herod, and Herod led them to Bethlehem, and they eventually found Jesus somehow. But I'm also very happy to say it was just supernatural. God put a bright light up there. Doesn't have to be explained. Led them straight there.
I just have also like I love imagery in the Bible, and I find there's so much reference to light, and there's a verse about writing the names in the stars, and later on in Matthew we'll get to another episode, but they talk about let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works. And I just personally, I like the imagery of light and the star as like a symbol in this situation. And I think it's like a power thing, like in the darkness there is a star, and it's everyone's talking about it, noticing it, wanting to follow and travel to it. And I like it as a symbol, hope symbol and power symbol in this.
That's good. And so you were sort of saying before that you sort of mapped out their journey.
I had to kind of map out to see Jesus's journey as a baby initially, and it started at Judea. To Egypt, to Israel, to Galilee, to Nazareth. And if you look at that on the map, it's actually a big journey, like when you actually look at it. And that just shows how significant this time was. And that really helped me get my head around like that Herod journey and the other things that you read in this chapter, just how big they were. And if you just imagine seeing that, looking down on that, the big journeys of lines of people with all their stuff and their animals and camels, whatever they're taking, it just, crazy.
I mean, Bethlehem to Egypt, huge journey.
Yeah.
And then to end up in Nazareth in like the north of Israel is pretty crazy.
With this baby that you don't know what's happened, what's the power, what's going to happen, like what's actually going to unfold. It's all so unknown. It's
hard enough with a newborn.
Yeah.
When you go back home, than to travel with it. Though I'm sure Jesus was a good baby.
I don't know. Whenever we sing the carol Silent Night, I'm like, he was just born. I'm sorry. He was screaming. Like he was born in a stinky manger. Like he was crying for sure. Like it always annoys me when we sing Silent Night, just putting it out there.
Oh, that's funny. But it's a huge journey, and it's like what we were sort of discussing a little bit offline, but now that we're recording is of this notion that we're reading what, sentence to sentence, and we don't comprehend unless we have a map or actually take the time to look at from point A to point B where they're going. It would have taken ages, years.
Which leads to something you said offline, Josh, to give you credit, is that like there is huge time periods between some of these verses as we read through this. Like when Herod orders everyone under 2 years old be killed, that's because it's been about 2 years from when the Magi first saw the star. Like we're already seeing huge time periods within this section. And
so these Magi, going on to it, that's what the classic, the three wise men, right? Yep.
The three wise men. Well, we don't know how many wise men, but there was 3 gifts they gave to Jesus. So unless there was a stingy guy in the back or one guy who gave multiple gifts, 3 feels like a decent number to...
I feel like with the Christmas story, we tend to sort of put everything together of like the shepherds and then the three wise men all happening at the one time, but that wasn't the case.
No, not at all. Happened over an extended period of time. Like by the time the Magi rock up to see Jesus, they're no longer using the Greek word for newborn. They're using the Greek word for young child. Like there's a shift there, and so it's been a while. by the time they get to Bethlehem.
It's just so interesting hearing that as a newbie, like that information. Like I just read through that and don't fathom that time difference, like we were saying.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, because Jesus would have been a toddler. Like, and would have been able to like, sort of receive those gifts.
Yeah, I'm sure he loved taking the frankincense and was like, excellent. Thank you for this gift.
So the other question I have is, what does magi mean?
That's a great question. I assume it's where we get the word magician or magic from. Like, effectively what they were was they were astrologers. They were officials or nobles of quite high esteem in the Persian Empire. Oh, the Parthians, the empire in that section of the world keeps changing names, but it's sort of the one people group that remains. And so they were like quite high up and quite intelligent people. This is the same type of person that Daniel, in the book of Daniel, came to lead in this section of the Babylonian Empire at the time. So you can see, if you read the book of Daniel, you see what a respected position in the nobility being an astrologer was. On the topic of the Magi, what I find interesting is I love anything that helps me authenticate the Bible a little bit. And there's always people who want to argue that the Bible was written like 100 years after Jesus, except we're told here that Herod welcomes these Magi who are from the East, except by the 2nd century, the Roman Empire was at serious war with the Sassanid Empire that was these people in the East. And so if you were just concocting this story in the 2nd century, you would not have had Herod welcoming these people that have just become enemies of the state. And so I always find that interesting that, once again, like the timing of Jesus' birth is incredible. Like the Romans had just initiated a period of peace that we hadn't seen yet. They just finished constructing roads across the entire empire so that a new message or gospel could go out everywhere. But like a little bit after, war sort of returns. So it's just this beautiful middle zone of like the perfect timing for Jesus to come.
And on this sort of on this journey that they're taking, I think for me, going through any parts of the Bible, there's this sort of romantic picture that gets sort of displayed, and especially going through Sunday school and all that. There's this sort of romanticized version or this sort of very peaceful version. But this could have, there would have been more threats than just Herod on their journey. There were, it would have been difficult. It would have been hard. It's not just Herod and his people going after them. There would have been, there could have been bandits. There could have been, like where you're going to get your food, your water. Like there's so much other things. So to go on this journey, like it's like, oh yeah, they're they're going off. It's like, no, this could have been real difficult for them.
Yeah, especially carrying gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Like those are some things worth robbing. But also, that's potentially what got them through their journeys. Like Joseph isn't working if they're traveling all over the Middle East at this time period, but suddenly they have these expensive gifts that potentially sustain them for a little while.
Yeah, and in here it says they got up in the night and left in the darkness. That would be so scary. And they had to flee to Egypt, which when I looked into it was about 90 miles from where they were. So that's pretty far till they were safe. So in the night, knowing you've got 90 miles ahead to try and get somewhere with a child, with all that stuff, like you're saying, all the scary things that could happen. Yeah, just the darkness. I'm all about the light and the dark. And that sounds, that just adds fear to that poor mother. Like, and so much has happened for them in that short period, early life. Like it's scary.
Yeah.
Imagine that being within your first year of marriage.
Yeah.
Like crazy.
Not planning for that. But then it shows their faith. To,
100%.
To sort of bring it back around. It's that faith and that trust in God, just to get up, we'll go. Yes, it's going to be scary, but we have this faith and this trust that we'll get through it.
Yeah. And I think Joseph is an underrated character. Like we only see him for 2 or 3 chapters at the beginning of the Gospels, and then he's never mentioned again. And yet what we see of him is he accepts Mary as his wife and Jesus as his son. He instantly flees to Egypt at the drop of a hat when told to. Like he is a faithful man, a man to be admired. And you could almost see why he was chosen by God to be the person who would bring up his son. And
that also wasn't told to him in person, that was told in a dream. So trusting in a dream as well, like not knowing if you just dreamt it or having that trust as well.
Sort of just reflect on my own life is like, would I just get up and go like that? You know, would
From
I
a
be,
dream, like
Yeah.
Yeah, if I had a supernatural angel experience, I'd be like, sweet, where am I going?
yeah.
Yeah,
I wake up from a crazy dream and I dreamed I was in Egypt. I'd be like,
yeah. I'd like to think that if God called me to, I'd immediately be like, yes. But you know, then there's a part of me that goes, well, the human side of me that goes, maybe I would question it. Maybe I would be very hesitant. Maybe I'd do the whole Jonah thing and like
go the other way.
Like there will be moments where you just need to go, or you just need to do, and you need to have that trust and take that leap and go for it, because God is with you and got you, and He's got your back. And it may be scary, and there will be those tough times. But yeah, like with this one, they return to Nazareth and Herod dies, and it's all safe for them to come back, and it's all through trust and in that obedience to, like, yep, well, we're now safe, and they can live out their lives through this sort of scary first period of life.
And I think a good lesson for us here, because I, as a pastor, like to actually apply God's word that we're reading, is that it's not just in the big life-changing things that we should listen for the instructions or commands or whisper of God. Like, I've had moments where I see someone standing alone, and I'm an introvert. I don't like talking to randoms or strangers, but you just feel a prompting and you go and talk to them, and it turns out to be really important for either them or you. And so there's just the small moments in life where we just need to trust and go and do, even if it's not as life-changing as, hey, your partner's going to have a kid, it's not yours, but they didn't cheat on you, so don't worry.
It's like, all right, cool.
I feel like that would have been a bit of power to him as well, knowing that, oh no, that was not, like, that was real, that happened. It was reassuring. So he's like, if I can get through that and that was real, I can do this journey. I can save my kid and wife and, be safe.
I think it's worth bringing up why we would include a birth story at all. Like, there's this famous quote from a theologian in the early church that says only pagans celebrate birthdays. And so I was like, well, why is Jesus' birth recorded in multiple gospels? Like, why is this so important? And I think it's important to think about that God, as Jesus, got the full human experience. He didn't magically come down from heaven at 30 years of age and start preaching, which is where several of the other gospels begin. But like, he was born. He grew up with this family. He matured. Like, he had the full range of human experiences, and his birth proves those facts. Like, we don't need a whole, several chapters of his childhood to show that he grew up with the human experience. We just need proof that he was born. And then to see how his birth so perfectly fulfills themes and prophecies from the Old Testament is just further proof of who he is. And so I think it just starts us off in the life of Jesus in a really good place. We're aware that he is significant. We're aware that he is fulfilling things, but we're also aware that there is ways in which we as Christians now can really relate to him because he had this experience of growing up.
I would love to know how Mary's birth was. Like, because she had this supernatural experience and this amazing gift of this child. Like, did she have an easy labor? Did she have it do you know what I mean? Just was it different because of the circumstance?
Well, like what you were saying about, God came as to be fully man. I would then imagine the birth would have been it wouldn't have been easy. It would have been just an easy breezy. It would have been like any other sort of birth. It would have been painful, and we don't know if there were any complications or anything. God was coming down as man to be like us. Yeah, I would imagine it wouldn't have been. It would have been rough.
Genesis 3 sort of promises that childbirth is always going to be a painful experience. Which is rough. I mean, we all get different curses from Genesis 3, but that is one of the significant ones.
Yeah. Yeah. You just think it's,
Yeah. It's like that whole, we get painted this picture of this romantic, of it was all fine. They found
easy birth, silent Jesus in a manger.
Yeah. The animals were fine around them.
I think that's me watching nativity scenes and stuff as a kid, saying, oh, that's cute and peaceful. And there's just angels and animals, and it's just, the manger just sitting there, it's calm.
A little drummer boy for some reason.
Yeah, there's no talk about if it was bad or if it was an easy birth. It's just interesting.
Yeah. Including that sort of birth, I think it's important because it reinforces that fact that he is man and man and God, but makes it so much more relatable to me. And you know, you sort of want to follow him even more because he was like us.
He knows the human experience while still being Emmanuel, God with us.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, like it could have been done so differently. They could have just placed a baby in a manger, not had Mary birth the baby. Like it could have been done so differently, but they used someone, like an everyday someone, to birth the child.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's God. He literally had infinite options for what he wanted to do.
Exactly.
But he chose that option.
Yeah.
So as we come to sort of a close, any final thoughts to wrap this up?
I feel like I already shared my final thoughts, which is about the idea of Jesus living the human experience. Like that is what I see in these early chapters of Matthew, is we get really, really important theological framework for everything we're going to read, and we're introduced to this character Jesus. He comes from an epic lineage. He was foretold and expected and fulfills things, but then he's born, which is just so unexpected. Like every good superhero story starts in like, I don't know, a hard childhood moment, or the moment they get their powers as they're a fully fledged adult. It doesn't start with here's them being born. And so it's just a great way to start off as we look at Matthew together. And I'm excited to dive into Matthew 3 and 4 next time.
That should be exciting. Morgan?
Yeah, I just think as a newbie, this story is so important. Like Matthew is so important, and it has been such a benefit for me to really thoroughly discuss this and talk about it and dive deeper into the information and hear the background of it. And for me, it's made it a lot more relatable, like you guys have been saying, like a real life human and what they went through, like the severity of the situation at the time. So it's been really cool to explore that further. And yeah, I can't wait. There's so much in Matthew that I am excited to go further with it.
Yeah, and I think for me, it's again, like what we're sort of saying, it's that relatability to it all, but it's get up and go when you're called. Like you may be afraid and it may be scary, but take up the call and go. Lockie, can I get you to pray for us?
Absolutely. Lord Jesus, we thank you so much for the Bible and the fact that we can read it together in this space and discuss it and understand you better. I ask that anyone who listens to this podcast, they will just take out the truthful bits of what we say. They will understand you better as a result of listening, and that would all continue understanding you at a far greater level. And because of that greater understanding, just love you more and more for what you've done for us and the experiences you went through for us. And so we thank you for this opportunity. Amen.
Amen. And thank you, Morgan. Thank you, Lachlan.
No worries. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for all those that have listening to this. I hope you got a lot out of it. And this encourages you to dive deep into your own Bible and exploring Matthew. And I hope that we can explore Matthew together. Please feel free to send any questions in to us on any of the sort of the social media platforms. We'd love to see what your thoughts are, as well as get your questions, because there's always going to be questions that come up. And then hopefully in the future we'll be able to attempt to answer them if we can, or answer them. This podcast will be available wherever you consume your podcasts. Make sure you follow us on socials like Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok for updates and news. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Expert PK and Newbie Podcast. Bye.
A Mustard Seed Creative production.